is Mr. Mick Bolognese. He's the senior curator up at the Birdwood Mill. For those of you that have participated in the Bay to Birdwood, I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit more about it and some of the exciting things that are happening up there. So I'll ask Mick if he would like to come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenton. Good evening, everyone. Didn't realise when I signed up for this gig that I'd effectively be following Neil Armstrong at a space conference. But that was extremely interesting, thanks Mel. And I didn't realise you were going to end on such a forward-thinking note, and I'm taking us into the past with museums, but I'm very much of someone who likes to think of what will happen to vehicles in the future. I watched a demonstration of a truck that Tesla have been supposedly developing, which is going to be, completely revolutionise road freight. So definitely the power of these batteries is amazing. And I will talk a little bit about EVs as I go forward. But first of all, I feel very welcome here. Thanks for inviting me over and to talk a bit about the museum. One of your members is one of the volunteers at the museum, Chris Howes. And I said to him, Chris, I'm not a Chrysler expert. I don't know what I'm going to talk to 300 enthusiasts about. And he said, well, don't talk about Chrysler in that case. Talk a little bit about the museum. I'm sure they'll find it interesting, so I hope that you do. And first of all, I won't do this too often because I don't like it when people do it at presentations, but a show of hands. How many of you have been to the National Motor Museum before? That's a lot. Great. Good. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about it in any case. I'll talk to my PowerPoint. I wanted to lead with this picture because if any of you haven't been to the Motor Museum in the last couple of years, it's probably not what you'd expect to see in there. So I arrived at the museum in 2014, and fantastic collection, but the museum, in museum world, the National Motor Museum, or the Birdwood Mill, as many of you still know it, was a bit caught in I guess, a previous era when motor museums tended to be neatly displayed cars, sometimes very nicely displayed, but with very little interpretation around them. And we've made this real strong, concerned effort to push ourselves into the 21st century and to attract new and diverse audiences. So this thing right here, many of you probably have no idea what it is. It's a Ferrari. No. Behind the Ferrari is an exhibition we call the Game Engine, which actually is a history of video games that have to do with motoring. It absolutely goes gangbusters. So sometimes you'll be in the museum, there's 100 people in the whole museum, and 95 of them are playing video games behind them. It's incredible. But that's not how the museum started. So the museum started in 1965. And it's a story that I'm going to guess is familiar to many of the couples in the room tonight. The gentleman in the foreground is a guy called Jack Haynes. So Jack Haynes was born at the turn of the century, 19th to 20th, and he was a motorcycle dispatch rider in World War I, and then he fought again in World War II. So a very distinguished veteran, and his passion for motorcycles endured into his life back at home. He was a schoolmaster, or school teacher, I think at Scotch College or St Peter's College, so a rather prominent private school in Adelaide. And he was a complete speed nut. He was caught doing 100 miles an hour on his Bruff Superior on the main street of Birdwood. But he had motorbikes filling up every part of his house. And at one point, supposedly, and once again the familiar story, his partner said to him, Jack, get these bikes out right now. Go find a place to store them. So he went for a ride in the Adelaide Hills, also the story goes, and he found the abandoned Birdwood Mill, which, just so you got a visual, that was it, which was an 1875 building, which for the last sort of 10 years had been used by the Birdwood Ping Pong Club to have their table tennis meets. They didn't modernise very well when modern milling techniques came in. So he bought the mill. And little by little, the Birdwood residents started seeing Jack bringing in first his motorbikes, then one of his former students, Len Bider, started bringing in some cars. At one point, a Gypsy Moth plane was going in the top window of the mill, which attracted quite a bit of attention. And so someone from across the road said, Jack, oh, this looks amazing, can I come and have a look? And he said, yeah, no worries, for a couple of shilling or whatever it was at the time, I'll let you in. So he opened up to the public as a commercial museum. And little by little, interest in the place grew. It started building a name for itself in the 1970s. And it wasn't just a motor museum, it was known as the Birdwood Mill Pioneer Art and Motor Museum. And I put this picture here purposely to show what a weird collection they had. So in the foreground, that weird spiral or cylindrical thing is actually a model of the Newmarket staircase. In the cabinet, just in the foreground, there's some dolls. There's a sign up there that says through the mineral gallery. It was anything but a dedicated motor museum. And sure enough, as time wore on, Jack and his colleagues grew a little bit tired of running a museum. It can be a tiresome business, and if you're running it commercially, it can be extremely tough. So he got out. He sold to a person called Gavin Sanford Morgan, and Gavin ran it for a bit. He had some really good vehicles, which are still with us today. But by the mid-1970s, he was ready to sort of move on as well. But such was the fame of the Birdwood Mill, as it was known across Australia, that or the Premier of South Australia at the time, Don Dunstan, said, well, no way are we letting this collection get dispersed and auctioned off, as happened, for example, at the Gosford Motor Museum, if any of you saw that recently. So the state of South Australia bought it. And I put this picture here specifically to show how in the first sort of 10, 15 years of the museum being owned by the state government, when it became the Birdwood Mill Motor Museum, it was actually doing really, really well. So this, I think, is from a Rock and Roll Rendezvous. I think it's the very first running of the Rock and Roll Rendezvous. Many of you are probably familiar with it as Chrysler owners. And very hard to see, but just at the top there, that's our current workshop. You won't be able to read the sign, but it says Restoration Workshop. I think that goes to show how well we were doing at the time. We had a fully running restoration workshop that was capable of doing things like this. So, anyone recognise Tom Cruise's truck there, the Leyland Badger? Well, the top picture shows what it looked like when it was picked up, and the bottom picture shows what it looked like after the restoration of it was done. Now, the restoration wasn't done by the National Motor Museum, I'll point out, entirely. We did assist, but we did things like this all the time. So a lot of the museums that we currently, a lot of the exhibitions that we currently have in the museum, the vehicles, were restored in this period. And it's fair to say that in the 1990s, the museum was thriving, had a really good reputation, and everything was on the up, much like the car industry. We were supported by Holden to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars a year for exhibitions, and everything was going along ticky-boo. So my second and last show of hands, in the time since then, how many of you have gone, geez, those plonkers at Birdwood have no idea what they're doing? Anyone? Go on, don't be shy. Because it's true. It's true. Thankfully I'm young enough that I don't have to take any of the blame for it. But something definitely happened after the 1990s. The museum kind of lost its way a little in certain ways. And I will make some apologies. It's tough. It's tough because we're in a tricky position. For starters, we're part of the government, and many of you are probably familiar with all the good and bad things that come with being a government organisation. In fact, we're an agency of the Crown, so I'm not really a public servant, but I kind of am. But no, the main thing is sort of the contrast between those two pictures. So that's the logo of my parent company, the History Trust of South Australia, and on the right is the logo of the National Motor Museum. South Australia, but national. We're not funded in any way by the national government or anyone like that. We're entirely funded by South Australia. But people come to the museum and they want to see a national motor museum. They want to feel represented, whether they're coming from Queensland or Tasmania or wherever, which is fair enough, because one of the probably silly things Don Dunstan did at the time was to claim the name National Motor Museum. So when I arrived, and I had, by the way, I had very little background knowledge here because I moved from Italy in 2001. So to me, I didn't even realise we had a National Motor Museum in South Australia. But I decided that we definitely need to live up to our name. So we started doing things like buying the Chamberlain 8. So the Chamberlain 8, many of you know Chamberlain John Deere tractors, or Chamberlain tractors. So the Chamberlain brothers, very interesting young engineers based in Melbourne. Before they built tractors, they were, much like I imagine Mel might have been in his younger years, a couple of rev heads who really just wanted to fang about the streets of Melbourne, driving the fastest thing they could. And they built what is, in many ways, a revolutionary vehicle. It's possibly the first space frame chassis car in the whole world. It's got this really ridiculous engine. You can just see it in the foreground. It's on a stand there, a bit like a Commodore. It's opposing, so 4 cylinders, 8 pistons. Revs extremely fast, and it's probably the most unreliable vehicle ever to race in an Australian Grand Prix. It led it by about 2 laps after 3 laps, and then broke down on the 4th lap. And never finished the race. But it's beautiful, and people love seeing it. They love the story that goes behind it, and most importantly, it's a famous vehicle around Australia. So we were able to secure it thanks to a grant from the federal government, a grant from the South Australian government, but also looking for donations over the counter from people who we realise are really quite happy to help when you can see some cool results. Another thing that we've recently installed is an exhibition called Alice Anderson's Motor Service. Alice Anderson was also from Melbourne, even though we're not meant to like Melbourners, but anyway, that's 2 things from Melbourne now. She was the first female garage owner in the whole country. So after World War I, Jack Haines is off fighting the war, as are many of the young men in Australia. But the people left on the home front who are keeping the country ticking along, the women who have gone to replace the men in the jobs that the men had. And so Alice learned from her dad and her brothers and the engineering firm that her dad had a lot of mechanical skills, and she quickly applied them. She was a very ingenious young woman, and started up a mechanic service that was entirely staffed by women in Melbourne in the 1920s, early 1920s, which is a pretty amazing story throughout, and it gets more and more dramatic. She was the first person to drive from Melbourne to Alice Springs in a vehicle. You can just see through those doors there's a little Austin 7. It's not the same one, but she did it on an Austin 7 in 1925 when there were no real roads to speak of between the 2 places. A really amazing feat. When she drove, well, she didn't drive back, sorry. Someone bought the car off her in near Alice Springs. And she caught the train back, and she was cleaning her gun on the weekend, which she'd taken along on the trip, and shot herself in the forehead at the age of 29, thus ending a brilliant young career. But her legacy, so we're talking almost 100 years ago, her legacy endures today. She's which is becoming a bit of a celebrity again, 100 years on, but she's still inspiring to a lot of young women who, not necessarily mechanically minded, but in all sorts of trades, still look at Alice as, sort of an inspirational figure. And another thing we've gotten a lot of kudos for recently has been an exhibition called Bush Mechanics. So, how many of you managed to catch it in one of the museums around Australia? Because we've been touring, I've seen a few hands. We've been touring nationally for a couple of years with this exhibition. So you remember Bush Mechanics? Yeah. Like I said, I moved to Australia in 2001. No joke. I turned on the TV, the very first time I turned on the TV in this country, and I went on to ABC, and there were these 4 Aboriginal guys. Their axle had dropped down, and they were strapping a mulga post to it with chicken wire and making the car run. It was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Turns out it was actually the most successful regional program the ABC ever produced. And so 13 years on, I was 27 years old, sitting in an interview room to get the position of National Motor Museum Curator, and they asked me, what exhibition would you do if you could do anything for the museum? And I said, Bush Mechanics. They gave me the job, and they gave me the task to make the exhibition, and it's now been travelling for 2 years. It's been to pretty well every big museum in Australia. And we just think it's a fantastic story. It really shows, a lot of what we deal with in our more frequent exhibitions is things like manufacturing, which are, Australia has a really, really proud and fantastic history of manufacturing, but it always ties back just that little bit to the US, as Mel is testament to. But Bush Mechanics is such an Australian thing, You're not going to find anything remotely similar anywhere else in the world, so particularly our foreign tourists love it. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, I guess I was trying to win you over. I want to win you back over. So we recognise that we've made some mistakes at the museum in the past. We realised that we didn't focus as hard as we probably should have on some of our interest communities. And I drove up here, obviously I didn't walk here. I drove up here at about 6:30 today. I parked with my fiancée Michelle just on that side. And we were greeted by this sea of, I don't know how many, 150 probably, Chryslers and like marks. I've been to this winery quite a few times before. This is easily the best it's ever looked, with your vehicles out the front. I see national rallies like yours probably every other week. They're just incredible. It's such a fantastic buzz. A lot of you've come from literally every state in Australia, except Tasmania, apparently. A lot of you probably haven't seen each other for 3 years. You're all bonding over your vehicles. I mean, I don't need to tell you how nice the atmosphere is here. So we recognise that there's such a thirst in the community to have a spot where they can congregate and enjoy the atmosphere that you're enjoying, in a spot where they really feel welcome. Not just welcome, but a spot that you own. So the first area we decided we really needed to focus on was the Beta Birdwood. So many of you have probably done the Beta Birdwood before. It's just completed its 39th year, so it's entering its 40th year, which is amazing. And our chairman, who's a marketing manager, came up with a brilliant but true line that the Beta Birdwood is one of the world's great historic motoring events. There's nothing in the world that really is truly like the Beta Birdwood for a number of reasons. The person you see on the right, entering the BMW Isetta 300, which was our concours winner on Sunday, that's the museum's director. And I mean, I picked that photo because it shows how much he loves the event. He was playing around with the owner of the vehicle, the guy on the right-hand side. He was one of the main driving forces behind a real sort of refreshing of the Beta Birdwood. So one of the main things that's happened is we've taken full ownership of the event. It used to be run jointly first by, I think, Channel 7 and the Federation of Historic Motoring Clubs. That's changed a few times over the years, but now it's fully owned by the National Motor Museum, just because we wanted to give it, I guess, streamline processes a bit, but also we're all paid staff to work on it. We try to make it as professional as possible, and really the main thing is we're all extremely passionate about the event. It's the best thing that happens at the museum all year. Next year it's changing. I've got some flyers here at the front that explain it in full, but the Beta Birdwood was always run as, on alternate years, there's a Beta Birdwood Run, which is for vehicles that are pre-1955, or that's changed over the years as well, and then there's a Beta Birdwood Classic, which is for more recent vehicles. So for you, for example, it would probably split you down the middle. A lot of you will have Valiants and things like that, and a lot of you I've seen with lovely DeSotos and earlier Chryslers and all sorts of things. So the 40th year that the Beta Birdwood runs, 2020, we're combining all the vehicles together. So we're going to have a huge parade, 1,750 of probably the best historic motoring vehicles in Australia. All do the run just as it's been in previous years, and if it's successful, we might well go ahead and use the same format going forward. Because the Beta Birdwood has the run, which is for the older vehicles, has been floundering a little bit, whereas the Classic's really, really popular, but a lot of people prefer to see the vehicles that are in the run. So we found ourselves in a tricky spot, and we think this new format's going to be extremely popular. This past year that's gone by has been the second most successful Beta Birdwood ever, and we're pretty confident that's going to be the best one. Another thing we've done, we've opened up to clubs. So starting from the 1st of January 2020, sponsored by the Beta Birdwood and by Shannon's, any motoring club that rocks up to the National Motor Museum, completely free. For all the members, anyone who rocks up in a car, it's free for you to come along. So we've waived our fees, simply because it's not sucking up. It's not something that it's not even something that we're doing for the clubs. The people who come to the National Motor Museum, we can't beat a day when there's, so that's, for example, that's the FX FJ Nationals. So 400 to 500 FXs and FJs rocked up to the museum on a random January Sunday earlier in the year. We can't beat that. We know that the best collection of vehicles is not with us, it's with you. So we want all the clubs to come as often as possible, because then we can promote that to the other people who come to the museum, and everyone gets to share Australia's motoring heritage together. here's another thing. We have a mechanic again. So since I've been at the museum, we haven't had a mechanic. And now for the last 4 or 5 days, we've had one finally again. That guy's name is Nigel. He's extremely talented and skilled. And the very first thing we've got him doing is our restoration project on the Hartnett. So do any of you know what the Hartnett is?
Yeah.
A lot of you will know who Sir Lawrence Hartnett is. So he was the managing director of Holden in up to 1948 or 49. But he was the father of the effects Holden. He had some fights with the Holden family, and he eventually ended up leaving the company and decided he could start his own. He used parts. Well, he basically built a rather weird car called the Hartnett Pacific, which is, you can see it there in the photo. There are only 3 of them known in the world, only one's ever been restored. So it's very significant. I mean, it's one of the very few survivors of a lost page in Australian motoring history. The other one's in private hands. No one will ever probably see it, other than at club runs and things like that. So that's something that we're trying to do now, is restore that, and we really want to activate that mechanical workshop again and get our collection back on the road. One thing that the Chrysler Club of South Australia do is sponsor 2 of our vehicles, so the Dodge Phoenix and the Chrysler Royal we have in the collection, 2 running vehicles. And the Dodge Phoenix ran in the Beta Birdwood just the other day, and Michelle, who's my fiancée, was actually the driver of it. It was fun. Incidentally, I thought it was hilarious because times have changed. My dad actually lived in the US in the 1960s. It wasn't even considered a full-size sedan when that car came out in the US, or the Dodge Dart Phoenix. I had to measure my parents' rather large garage to check that it would fit in, and it cleared by probably about 70 mil. So obviously times have changed. Now, who can guess what this is? Yes, many of you won't recognise it in that form, but perhaps in this form. Sorry, it's upside down, but we weren't going to drive our cherry picker on the grass. So that is a sign from the Chrysler factory at Keswick. Many of you will know that Kaufland, who are going to compete with Aldi or whatever they're going to do, have arrived in Australia. They've taken over the old Lecornu site and they've knocked it all down. Chris, I can't remember, where is he? There he is. Chris was my gaffer for the last few weeks, running over to see what stage of demolition they were in. So that was probably the very last thing to basically go from the whole site. They were under promise to us to let us know when it came down, so that we could save it. So we're still not entirely sure what's going to happen to the sign. Currently there are talks of relocating it to Tonsley, which is obviously where Chrysler itself relocated. But we also, just today when we were mucking around with it, realised there's a fantastic spot for it just on our grounds. So we found a spot where it would fit, where you can still park your car underneath it and have that photo that many of you will have enjoyed taking over the years. Your car will fit underneath it, and everyone's a winner basically. So the main reason that we've done that is that we see preserving and sharing Australia's motoring history in all of its forms, whether it's a sign from an old factory that we just happen to know that the community love taking their photos underneath, whether it's something like the Beta Birdwood, whether it's something like an exhibition on Australia's first female mechanic. All these things are important, they all add up. It's very hard to keep everyone happy, but we certainly are trying our darn hardest, and I'll close off there. And even though I've just told you that you can come for free from the 1st of January 2020, if you like, I've got a whole stack of buy one get one free vouchers for the museum at the front, which I'll happily share.
Is there any questions for Mick before he goes? All happy? Yes.
Your restoration workshop, is that volunteers, paid staff, or both?
Pretty much weekly I get an email from someone saying they'd like to work in the workshop, but without a mechanic who's running the workshop, we can't obviously have volunteers who are, come at odd times going in it. The very first thing that I asked the mechanic in the interview was, what are your skills in managing a volunteer force? Because absolutely, volunteers are, they outnumber us something like 4 to 1 at the museum. They're very much at the core of what we do. So we're hoping hoping that Nigel will be supported by stacks and stacks of volunteers, because the more people, the more work gets done.
Yes.
The table on A, 4 cylinders, 8 pistons, how does that work?
So the pistons at the top act effectively as valves as well. And there's 2 crankshafts. It's 2-stroke too. Yeah. So it's a weird bit of kit. The Chamberlain brothers, you know, this is obviously going back to 1920s engineering. They had this beautiful little hand-drawn and I guess moving diagram for timing, which I just find the loveliest thing. But it shows very well the workings of the engine. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it was extremely unreliable, as I said. Apparently, their cousin, Harry Hawker, who was an aviator, was the person who finally managed to design some spark plugs that would make the whole engine run. But even then, I mean, we've got about 70 or 80 of them. We have about 15 cracked pistons. It never ran very reliably.
Thank you, Mick. I'll hand over to our President Greg again to make a presentation. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Mick, for coming, and just to present you with this sort of president for doing the presentation tonight. And once again, thank you very much.